Rising petrol prices are causing havoc for inflation and for airlines. A major super fund is going to fight back against boards without enough women this AGM season. And Lego has ditched its plans to make its bricks from recycled plastic bottles. Welcome to Fear and Greed Business News, Australia's best business podcast. It is Tuesday, the 26th of September, 2023. I'm Michael Thompson and Sean Aylmer is back next week. In the meantime, I'm joined by Jennifer Duke. Jen, good morning.
Good morning, Michael.
Now, Jen, immediately after the show, you have an interview coming up, and it's a really interesting chat with Matthew Gabriel, who is the founder of Market Index and now the executive director at Livewire Markets.
Yeah, he's got a really fascinating startup story. So he actually managed to make a huge success with Market Index. He's got hundreds of thousands of monthly users. We use it here on Fear and Greed as well. It's a really great service, and he's actually had to work through a fair few hurdles and was very open about it. It's a good chat.
Yeah, it's a website that a lot of investors would be quite familiar with because it is basically a portal to the ASX. And so it is, you are right, a really interesting, fascinating startup story. Well worth a listen. It's coming up a bit later on. But the main story this morning, Jen, rising petrol prices are causing havoc for inflation, for drivers and potentially a whole range of businesses. Prices surged past $2.20 a litre last week in many capitals. And unfortunately, there are no signs of easing up anytime soon.
Yeah, if you've filled up your car in one of the major capital cities over the past few days, you've probably felt the pain of the prices rising. So Sydney actually broke a record for regular and leaded petrol prices last week. The latest NRMA weekly fuel report has Sydney at 220.4 cents for unleaded and 221.4 cents for diesel. And similarly high prices are being seen in Melbourne. So there was about a 9% jump in prices at the pump over August. And that's on the back of oil prices up almost 30% since the end of June due to a global supply crunch. There was a note out yesterday from Morgan Stanley, and it said that high demand for key petroleum products is affecting refinery runs, but the industry is also hit with logistical issues and hot weather, among other challenges right now, and they're expecting margins to be driven to historically high levels and remain high until more capacity kicks in later next year.
All right, let's look at the economic angle of this because you are, of course, the economics correspondent for Capital Brief. So this is something that you would be looking at closely. Everyone has been focused on inflation for some time now. How does this feed into those figures?
So fuel's a really big input cost for plenty of businesses, obviously, and of course households for people who are driving. And we're getting inflation data out on Wednesday for August, and the markets are currently expecting headline inflation will be up 5.2% for the year to August. So that's a 0.2 percentage point increase compared to the year to July. Now, Westpac senior economist Justin Smirk is saying that rising fuel prices will be a meaningful positive factor. It's driving up those inflation figures, basically. And the Reserve Bank's going to be looking closely at inflation data. The board's due to meet again next week to decide on interest rates. Thankfully, they're very aware that some of the spike in inflation will be due to that rising petrol price, and it's a result of Saudi Arabia and Russia's activities cutting the global supply of oil, but they will factor that into their decision-making. And this is also playing into the political narrative again, because opposition leader Peter Dutton was telling the media yesterday that the government needs to refocus back on the cost of living issues, including petrol prices.
Yeah, I suppose regardless of what happens with interest rates, this will affect businesses and it will be affecting them now, wouldn't it?
Definitely. So, of course, petrol retailers, Ampol, Viva Energy Group, they've been paying out higher dividends than was really expected a year ago because of this. But some of our biggest companies are really struggling with the rising input costs. So Qantas yesterday posted a market update where it said that fuel costs are biting into the bottom line. It's rising $200 million. That's to $2.8 billion after hedging. And there's another $50 million impact in there due to foreign exchange changes. So for now, it's going to absorb those costs and take a profit hit rather than pass it along through rising fares, but it could mean an increase in the cost for passengers in future. That's if the rise in oil prices and fuel more generally continues. Now, Qantas will need to figure out how to keep striking a balance between absorbing these costs and passing them along. And they won't be the only business grappling with these price pressures by a long shot. Of course, this all then feeds back into those inflation figures.
And just quickly, Jen, before we leave Qantas altogether, the backlash against the airline continues.
That's right. The airline's pilots have now called for Chairman Richard Goyder to stand down. It's a pretty dramatic step up from staff after everything that's happened.
Oh, yeah. And they are a fairly powerful group within the airline. So this story is not going away anytime soon. How did local markets perform yesterday?
So the S&P ASX 200 actually closed up, but only a little bit, 0.1% to 7,077 points. It was a pretty flat day. It was mixed in terms of sectors. Information technology and communication services did best over the day. Technology one was up 4%. Uranium businesses did pretty well. Paladin Energy was up 6.1%. Metals and mining and materials were the weakest sectors. Chalice mining led the fall, slumping 5.1% over the day.
And what's happening in international markets?
The ex-co-chairman of Goldman Sachs and former US Senator and Governor of New Jersey, John Corzine, is closing his hedge fund and giving capital back to investors. So Corzine, who's actually the former CEO of collapsed MF Global Holdings, he has about $510 million in global assets, including leverage in the money management business firm in New York. That's according to Bloomberg. Now, also in the US, the Nature Conservancy, which is a nonprofit group that's been driving the use of sovereign debt to help fund marine conservation, is ditching the term blue bonds. So it's a sign of this blurry line for investors and asset managers when seeking sustainable investments. Now, there have been some concerns that terms like blue bonds overstate the environmental benefits when not all of the funds are specifically required to be used for conservation. And over in India, their highest value banknote, which is worth 2,000 rupees, is being withdrawn from circulation. And that means that people have until the end of this month to exchange or deposit them at the banks. This withdrawal was announced in May, but there's still 240 billion rupees of these notes in circulation.
Hang on, 240 billion?
That's right. It's a huge amount.
Oh, goodness me. That's a great story. I like that one. Now, Jen, there's a lot we need to cover. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Now, Jen, a big story in politics. Home Affairs Secretary Michael Pezzullo has stepped aside as an investigation takes place about hundreds of leaked messages that he sent to Liberal Party member and lobbyist Scott Briggs.
There's an independent investigation being undertaken now by the Australian Public Service Commissioner. And that was after Channel 9 revealed Pezzullo allegedly sent messages to Briggs that were critical of politicians. That included Julie Bishop and Maurice Payne. Public servants are actually required to act in an apolitical and independent way. And these messages were discussing allegedly ministerial appointments, government policy and politics to the extent that he encouraged a more right-wing conservative leader during the 2018 election spill. Now, the Greens have called for him to be sacked outright. Opposition leader Peter Dutton, who was formerly Home Affairs Minister, said that he always acted professionally when he worked with him. Pezzullo himself has yet to comment.
In slightly more upbeat political news, Jen, the employment white paper that we spent a lot of time talking about last week has been formally released, and there are 31 future reform directions, including the National Skills Passport that we discussed in yesterday's show.
Yes, we did. The government is going to be really focused on accelerating the take-up of higher apprenticeships in priority areas. So they've put net zero, care and digitalisation at the top of that list. Pensioners and veterans are going to get their work bonus permanently extended. That allows them to earn more from working without reducing their benefits. And part of this whole thing is about reducing barriers to let those who want to work more do so without being penalised. That's particularly during a time like right now of acute skills shortages for businesses. And they also want to reform the local jobs program to improve flexibility and provide new practical initiatives to help job seekers. They're also going to double the period of time that those moving out of unemployment and back into work can use their concession cards. And providing more access to early childhood education is back at the top of the list.
Now, this next story is a fascinating one, but it's really been quite a saga, hasn't it? Matt Berryman, who founded one of the fastest growing startups in Australia, has lost his 2-year court fight against Google.
So Berryman created this unlocked business, and it let customers watch ads each time they unlocked their phone. And in exchange for that, they got rewards and discounts like off their phone bill. And it had really major backers. That included Lachlan Murdoch. There was huge names involved, but it all came to a halt and went into administration when Google banned its apps from its services. Now, this was right ahead of a planned $200 million IPO, and it completely slashed the company's revenue. So Berryman then took Google to court in California over claims that its behavior was anti-competitive, but the judge has now sided with the search giant.
Wow. All right. I mentioned this one at the top of the show. Super fund HESTA is going to use its voting power at upcoming AGMs to hit out at overly male-dominated boards.
Yeah, Michael. So the fund sent letters to chairs and CEOs at almost 300 of the biggest ASX listed companies that it has a stake in to tell them that it would be active at upcoming annual general meetings. And its big focuses are climate policies, biodiversity loss, and yes, gender diversity. So if boards have less than 30% female representation, HESTA intends to vote against the male directors being re-elected. And if the executive teams are male dominated, they'll be voting against the chair. Now, there are still many companies whose boards are entirely male on the ASX. So this could actually be quite a lot of backlash voting this year.
How do you feel about AGM season, Jen? Because Sean and I often have this debate.
How do I feel about it?
Yeah, because I always say that I think AGM season is fascinating because you always get good stories coming out, and it's often where you might see some protests and a little bit of kind of
colour.
Yeah, lots of colour. Whereas I think Sean maybe, and I don't want to kind of put words in his mouth because he's not here to defend himself, but it feels like he's a little bit jaded now after having attended a lot of AGMs and covered a lot of AGMs. I think he's I think the highlights for him were now the sandwiches at the AGMs, and even they don't serve those for digital AGMs.
Look, I think I probably sit right in the middle between both of your perspectives because I do feel like AGM season is the theatre of business. It is definitely where we get to see all of, the big names rolled out. You might get the unions out the front protesting all the rest of it, and it's very exciting. But whether or not it leads to actual material change, I mean, I still have a bit of a question mark over that myself.
Okay, so you're taking a bit of a neutral position. You're a Jennifer Switzerland Duke from now on.
There are worse things to be known as.
I suppose that's true. Now, the Council of Financial Regulators, which sounds like a particularly thrilling body, have met and believe the nation remains well placed to handle any slowdown in China's economy, and locally, that rising interest rates are affecting household balance sheets.
So the council's made up of 4 major regulatory agencies. That's the Reserve Bank, Treasury, the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, and the Australian Securities and Investments Commission. Might not sound especially thrilling, but they're all very, very important, and they meet once a quarter. And this time their meeting minutes show significant attention was actually placed on the potential risk of economic troubles in China, our biggest export and import partner. And they confirmed that any kind of sharp slowdown in China could hit Australia through our trade relationship and also increased risk aversion in global markets. And they said that China's economy has increased uncertainty due to those stresses in its property sector that we've been talking about quite a bit. And in terms of Australia's property market, the regulators said that households had remained largely resilient to higher interest rates and rising cost of living pressures. And most borrowers have actually reduced their spending, drawn down on savings, or found extra work to manage with that. But there was a noticeable pickup in borrowers starting to fall behind on repayments. That's a little bit concerning.
Yeah, it is. Now, Santos Managing Director Kevin Gallagher is moving to flexible work for the rest of the year. This is sadly due to a family member needing intensive medical treatment.
Yeah, Gallagher's going to be stepping away from some external commitments and will delegate some of the day-to-day work to members of his executive leadership team, but he's going to remain CEO. So Santos has told investors that he will keep overseeing these growth initiatives that they have underway, but he won't be doing as much travelling away from Adelaide where he lives. So Santos Chair Keith Spence said the board is really confident he's still going to be able to execute his role effectively.
This is an interesting one. Jen, the Commonwealth Bank thinks that Australians are getting better at picking up on scams.
So CommBank's own prevention detection program has identified $228 million in scams. And they say that 8 in 10 people are more confident now in their ability to detect scams. That's according to their own customer research, with 3/4 becoming more concerned about scams over the last year. And this actually aligns with their customer loss data. So CBA's internal data from January to June this year shows that customer losses are down 37%, but that's compared to the last 6 months of 2022. Now, they told me that they didn't have any available data for the comparative period last year, so we don't know if there's some seasonality at play here in this data. It's highly possible that Christmas, the new financial year, results in a big spike in scams, but it's a positive signal at least that maybe banks are getting ahead of the scam activity that's been on the rise for years.
Yeah, that would be good news if that was the case. One last one before we get to international news. Jen, the federal government is going to keep on pushing the case against China's tariff on Australian wine imports at the World Trade Organization.
So these wine tariffs have been in place since 2020, but since barley tariffs were lifted, there have been signs of improving relations, and there's been growing speculation that these wine tariffs would be lifted too. So China's been seeking a package solution to address the concerns over wine tariffs, and that would have tied the issue to a dispute on steel that's also underway. But Agriculture Minister Murray Watt has ruled this out. He says these matters are entirely separate, and the World Trade Organization case would continue. This issue has led to a massive backlog of wine in storage in Australia, though.
Right, turning to international news, Italy is further winding back its plans to slug major banks with a windfall tax, which resulted in double-digit share price falls for major Italian banks and sparked international speculation that other governments could consider similar taxes.
So a real quick refresher on what happened back in August. The Italian government really shocked the markets and the banks by announcing a plan to slug lenders with a 40% windfall tax on profits. And that was because of a jump in net interest margins. And it was around these concerns that banks had passed on higher interest rate costs to borrowers, but hadn't shared the gains with savers by raising deposit rates. So the government then appeared to backtrack by saying that it would be capped at 0.1% of a bank's total assets. There's now a new clause in the windfall tax that gives banks a complete alternative option to paying the levy at all. So they can use gains from increases in net interest margins to improve their underlying cash reserves rather than pay the one-off cost to the government. That's according to Financial Times, which saw an early draft of the rules. And the European Central Bank asked Italy to reassess the tax recently, saying that it would leave the financial sector at more risk to downturns.
French President Emmanuel Macron is trying to tackle the rising cost of fuel prices in a slightly new way. He's putting pressure on the oil sector to sell their gasoline and diesel at cost.
So we previously talked about France's plans on Fear and Greed to allow servos to temporarily sell fuel at a loss, but this got a lot of pushback and he's now scrapped that idea. So instead, Macron is meeting with the oil and gas giants this week in France to seek more transparency on their margins and request that they sell at cost for the time being. So the French government has previously given major subsidies to petrol buyers, and that was to help ease tensions among the public with the cost of living crisis. But this comes at a significant cost to the government, and that means that they cannot afford to take that approach again.
So they're essentially asking the companies to take a hit for them for a little while.
That's right. Don't know they're going to go for that.
You can imagine how well those conversations are going to go. So, I'm sorry, you want us to do what?
I really do want to see the outcome of it. It'll be a fly on the wall for that discussion.
Oh, yeah.
It's a big ask, don't you think?
It is indeed. We'll see how that one plays out. Now, last one, Jen. Going green isn't straightforward, and Lego has now discovered just how hard it can be. The toy maker was trying to create an oil-free plastic block, but has had to scrap its plans.
Yeah, so Lego was attempting to get rid of oil-based plastics from these super popular bricks. Your kids probably have them. But instead, it's found its plan to use recycled bottles would instead lead to greater emissions than its current production. And that's because it would require all this new equipment. Now, that's after 2 years of creating a prototype brick using recycled plastic. Right now, oil-based plastics are used in 80% of its bricks, that's according to Bloomberg, and it makes billions of new individual blocks a year. So they've tried hundreds of different materials, and they can't find one that makes them more sustainable and still does all the good stuff that Lego bricks do. And instead, they're now focused on reducing the carbon impact of their existing blocks. So at the moment, it takes 2 kilograms of petroleum to make 1 kilogram of plastic. And Lego is still aiming to get rid of single-use plastic bags in its packaging, though.
Here's an idea that I'm not even going to charge Lego for. Have they considered making a sponge-based Lego brick? Because have you ever trodden on Lego bricks in bare feet, perhaps at night?
No, I have not. You can tell I don't have children.
There is nothing more. Look, you know what? You wouldn't even need to have kids because you wouldn't even need to have Lego in your house because somehow these things can find a way under your feet, wherever you are. And there is nothing sharper than one of these small Lego bricks in the middle of the night, straight into the sole of your foot. And seriously, you have never felt pain like it.
Oh.
And so that's my advice to Lego.
It's kind of funny because one of the issues they had was finding a material that had something called a clinging factor, where the two blocks will still stick together but be hard enough that they're durable for children. So maybe they should just give up on that and go with your sponge idea. I quite like it.
Go to sponges. It might catch on. Up next is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. You're speaking with Matthew Gabriel, the founder of Market Index and executive director at Livewire Markets.
Yeah, Matthew was sharing his insights on what it feels like to go from founder to employee and why being MD was never actually for him, which was very honest and open and actually very refreshing. It was a good chat.
It is a good chat. It's up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. Thank you, Jen.
Thanks, Michael.
It is Tuesday, the 26th of September, 2023. Make sure you're following the podcast and please join us online as well on LinkedIn and Instagram, X and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson and that was Fear and Greed Business News. Have a great day.